Hey everyone, today we're going to be beginning our last little lecture on new religious movements, and today I thought we'd talk about something that's kind of lighthearted, something that I find quite fun to discuss, and something that is just a riot to me to read the materials and to cover. But I wanted to talk about parody religions. Parody religions are something that has kind of been on the rise ever since really the invention of the internet in the 90s. Well, the wide use of the internet for public domain in the 90s. But it has picked up steamed in the mid 2000s, particularly with the election of President Bush, uh, the rise of the value voter or the religious right resurfacing again. And they've kind of emerged as a counter reaction to the demands and the decries of the religious right. And so this is why I think it's important to talk about them, is because they do represent a small but important minor voice with discussing the role of religion in culture. And so today we're going to be looking at these parody religions and then also just to have a little bit of fun as well. So let's begin here. So let's kind of recap, like we always do, what we have discussed thus far. And so in our previous lectures, we've already discussed some of the general characterizations of new religious movements. And we've highlighted two specific examples that kind of represent broad categorizations of these new religious movements. Remember, a lot of these NRMs, you can't really truly define them or put them inside in kind of a tight knit box, but rather they're kind of a loose categorizations. And so we kind of lumped some together with these two groups that we have discussed already and that we'll discuss here today. So the first is with what we've already discussed with Scientology. And those groups are NRMs that are typically quite novel in their approach. And so that's why they represent something quite different, quite unique, because either they have new language, new religious vocabulary that they introduce to the public sphere, new procedures, new practices, new books, new writings, things like that that are quite novel, and they aren't so heavily reliant upon individuals having a pre-knowledge of an already established religion. They pretty much give you a new religion and a new philosophy and a new worldview. And so Scientologist is probably the greatest of all examples. Another example would be the Heaven's Gate religious cults from the 1990s. Also, kind of New Ageism, I would say as well. But that's less so, but because they're so reliant or they pull together so many various elements of Buddhism, Native American religions, Eastern thought, and philosophy. But I kind of see them as something new. But with Scientology, we already discussed that they bring something novel, something new to their approach of religion. And also, one of these main characterizations is that these new religious movements, like Scientology, are quite appealing to people because they represent something completely different from their own culture. They are a counterculture, if you want to call them. And many people who find themselves emerged within this group do so primarily because they're largely dissatisfied with the traditional religious, yeah, kind of the religious nature of things, whether their cultural background, the religious options in in their surrounding area. They've just largely become dissatisfied with either Protestantism, um, Catholicism, Judaism. Typically, you don't see many people from the East abandoning their traditions, but are starting to see second and third generation immigrants here in America or in the UK starting to do that because their traditions have become less and less prominent in their lives or in their cultures. So typically somebody joins these groups because, again, it's something fresh, something different perspective. They feel like it's a answer to a lot of things that they have been searching for and things that they have been questioning about their own religious traditions, but yet have not felt comfortable enough in bringing them out or forsaking their own group. Now you kind of have an excuse with this new religious group. Or sometimes they often overpromise things or they promise immediate benefits, so why people rush and flock to these new religious groups. Scientology, particularly, is one of those groups that promises its practitioners immediate results through their counseling sessions, through the use of e-meters, through changing of diets and exercise, that they do produce immediate results for their practitioners and for their followers. And so a lot of people are instantly drawn to them because they can automatically see a change in other people's lives or the lives of themselves. And so Scientology, again, represents one of those characterizations. Another characterization that we talked about are those of the Mormons in the Mormon Church. We discussed how these NRMs are like the Mormon Church, like Jehovah's Witness, like the Seventh Day Adventist Church to some extent, like Hare Krishna movement, that they're largely dependent upon or in direct reaction to a dominant religious tradition within their circles. And so Mormonism is both. It's dependent upon a person's knowledge of the Christian story, but also it's in reaction to the Christian traditions and the Christian story that was going on during its day, or more so the church's story that was going on to its day. Joseph Smith was widely um, critical of the of what he saw that was going on with the denominationalism in America and the fracturing of the churches into these various groups instead of one church like there is in Europe, the Catholic Church. In America, there's thousands upon churches that one can attend. And Joseph Smith and Mormonism is a direct reaction against that. Also, they like to see themselves as well as restoration movements. The Mormon Church is very much part of that. They see themselves, they put themselves back within the tradition of even the Jewish people, ergo predating the rise of Catholicism and the rise of Protestantism and their claimed traditions. The Mormon Church claims our traditions go back further, so therefore we are older, therefore we are more reliable, therefore we're the truth, and that type of logic. And that was very common. The ancient Greeks did this all the time with their religious traditions. Typically, the older a religion is, the more truthful it was because it had traditions. And so the Mormon Church tried to create that tradition by claiming that they, as followers, and as a tradition, go all the way back to this lost tribe of Israelites who eventually made themselves to America, and Jesus coming and presenting the true gospel, unadulterated, to the Americans, the who are also Jewish at this point too, but to the Americans. But yet the Bible and the church tradition that has been preserved by the Catholic Church or Europeans has been corrupted. And what the Mormon Church has is a restoration, is the truth. And that's how the Mormon Church sees themselves. Jehovah's Witnesses see themselves somewhat quite different, same as way, similarly in the same vein as well. They try to restore themselves back to a original idea of what church life is supposed to be. So again, these groups are more like restoration movements aimed within the original truth, getting back to the original truth or fixing the traditions that they're in to be more corrective. And so, of course, um, the best example, really the best example of one of these new religious restoration movements is Protestantism. Protestantism emerged out of Catholicism, and Catholicism for a very long time thought of Protestantism as a cult. Similarly, that some people today might think of Jehovah's Witness as a cult. Just over time, eventually, in sheer numbers, the Catholic Church was forced to recognize Protestantism is its own thing now, it's legitimate, and we need to recognize it in force. But for today's lecture, we're looking at something quite different. We're looking at a relatively new phenomenon. Like again, I said that it emerged really with the advent of the internet for public use in private homes, but really more so with the 2000s coming out. And so these new religious movements are what we know as parody religions because they're really created to be a parody of religion as a whole. But more specifically, because most of these parody religions come and have formed in the United States, ergo, they're parodies of Christianity and the dominance that Christianity plays in American life. And so they're purposeful, or the purpose of these religions is very much so to mock religion. And so you might be asking me now, Joe, why are you labeling this a religion? If it's the sole purpose of mocking a religion, can't we just categorize this as criticism, critics of religion? And you could be true. I mean, there are some religious scholars who actually do that, who say some of these new religious movement groups that that's exactly what they are. They just simply are large, criticisms or jokes. They're seen as jokes and to brush them off. However, the only reason I put them as religions, and other scholars like me put them as religion, is because they start to develop religious characterizations. They either start forming institutions, hierarchies, they start forming communities, and then many of them have started to organize themselves as a religion and see themselves as religion after the joke is kind of worn off a little bit. And so, therefore, I put them as a religion simply because they start showing the some of the characteristics of established religions. They have, again, some kind of institutional control, or they have some kind of recognition that they're either seeking to be recognized as religion amongst their community or amongst their peers, or by the United States government. And we'll talk about one who has kind of tried to be recognized as a religion. So I interpret that as these people wanting to see themselves as a religion. So therefore, I take them seriously in categorizing them as religion. However, again, most people, this is a joke, and so you're fine if you think this is a joke. You're quite all right in doing so because, again, it really is a joke. But again, some of the followers have taken the joke a little too far, and it's kind of turned into a religion. And so that's why I felt it was important for us to talk about it. So the next thing that I want to talk about is just kind of why is this a thing? And I've kind of highlighted some aspects of it is because followers have made it so a thing, and that's why we have to talk about them. But there's really two main reasons that I have studied for myself, or what I would think as reasons why this is a thing. First, parody religions have kind of emerged in basic reaction to the dominant role that religion plays and that it continues to play within a secular society. Um, since the European Enlightenment, governments and countries of modernity, modern day countries, have tried to progress themselves further and further away from the bonds of religion. The United States government was one of the first to do that to some extent, as well as the early forms of the French Republic that was established in the 1790s, that tried to establish their own form of government away from the powers or the strong bonds that religion sometimes play. And so historically, religion has and frustrated and has purposefully slowed down societal progressions. And that's why our early founding fathers wanted to have this separation of church and state, not only for believers to have this kind of freedom in a new country, but also to free government, to free people for expansion or government to expand beyond the roles that have been traditionally seen in Europe because the Catholic Church had largely curtailed them. And unfortunately, with religion and society, sometimes this reaction has been quite violent and continues to be quite violent. We're seeing this played out even with our own political circumstances with United States elections. Every time we have a presidential election, religion card gets played quite early, and or anytime there's a Supreme Court vacancy, religion card pops up again, and some of these confrontations can be quite violently or abusively. And it's a real problem. And so this is why parody religions have emerged, is because many people are sick and tired of the religious debate that goes on. Why is it so important for a president, even when he's not religious, doesn't even attend churches, to fake being religious? We all know it's a game. We all know he's ploying to get votes, and people are so much suckers for it. And we all see a lot of times that the religious debates are really just um, political strategies to get people riled up and angry and to vote certain ways. And so, again, a lot of these conflicts emerge, but really the best example of this, I'm going to share a quick video of it, is we've seen with the history of the religious conflicts with both religion and science, and more specifically, that of the early days of the scientific revolution. And so I'm talking about Nicholas Copernicus, Johann Kepler, and Galileo Galilei with the Catholic Church. And so hopefully the YouTube will start here. There it goes. It's just being slow. And of course you have that.
I've always loved sci-fi.
That commercial. So sorry about the commercial.
And the idea of being right on the edge.
But regardless, we owe much of this change to the scientific revolution. So like the Reformation, the scientific revolution was another break with religious teachings. The Catholic Church taught that the earth was the center of the universe and had been so since the creation. The sun, moon, and planets traveled around the earth in perfectly circular orbits like the rings of an onion. And beyond the onion was the realm of the divine, whose light pierced through in the form of stars. All this perfect motion was the work of God himself, and any other understanding of the universe was therefore a challenge to God's eternal perfection as described in the scriptures. But like good Renaissance people, the new astronomers and mathematicians and their colleagues in other fields declared that these old theories needed to be re-examined. The first problem was that the perfect orbits of the planets and moon and sun did not fit with observation, causing astronomers to resort to ancient Ptolemaic explanations, basically that the planets followed their own circular paths, which also revolved around the Earth. Anyway, just before his death in 1543, Polish-born Nicholas Copernicus, a well-connected doctor of canon law and a researcher in mathematics and astronomy and classical literature, published On the Revolution of the Celestial Spheres. He noted problems with classical astronomical theory and determined that the universe was heliocentric, that is, the sun rather than the earth was at the center. The Catholic Church's reaction to this was negative. The Italian monk Giordano Bruno, for instance, was burned at the stake in 1600 for teaching Copernicus's heliocentric findings. But even earlier than that, in 1572, Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe spotted a new star, and in 1577, a new comet, further confirmation that the universe was not immutably and perfectly created. Then Johannes Kepler's laws of planetary motion announced early in the 17th century that the orbits of the planets were elliptical, not perfectly circular. The solar system was a solar system, and it wasn't an onion. Something other than divine will was keeping the planets apart and in motion. Let's go to the thought bubble. By this time, the observations of Galileo Galilei were bringing matters to a head. Galileo was obsessed with science, especially its mathematical features and the calculations at the base of Copernicus's heliocentric theory. Galileo's father had wanted him to become a doctor, but mathematics drew him in. It's the oldest story in the world. He invented many tools like an early thermometer and his own telescope, which he used to dramatically improve human understanding of the universe. He was the first person to observe the moons of Jupiter and the first to understand that the Milky Way was a collection of stars. The telescope also showed irregular spots on the sun, a further sign of heavenly imperfections that went against the beliefs espoused by the Catholic Church. Despite Galileo's prestige as a mathematician, his work on the nature of the universe went too far for the Church. In 1615, Galileo went to Rome to teach the clergy about the heliocentric universe and convince them of its accuracy. In 1616, it was condemned as heretical, and Galileo promised not to teach that the Earth moved. But in 1632, he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, in which he described the Ptolemaic system, on which the Church based its Earth-centered astronomical teachings, and the Copernican system. In 1636, the Roman Inquisition found him guilty of heresy and forced him to recant in order to avoid execution, and so Galileo recanted. In 1992, after a 13-year investigation, the Catholic Church finally publicly acknowledged that the judgment against him had been wrong. Thanks.
But yeah, so I wanted to show you that real quick. Oh, make that. Sorry. There we go. So yeah, that was just a little brief example of the huge debate and the frustration, because again, it took from 1632, 1635 for the all the way up until 1992 for the Catholic Church to admit it was wrong in its accusations against Galileo Galilei. You saw the death of various scientists that were discussed by John Green in direct reactions and relationship to the societal and scientific revolution that was going on, that needed to happen to advance our society to what we have today of being able to hold an iPhone, a small computer, within our hands. And so that was very much a necessity. And you can see why people want to mock religion, because religion has constantly been at the forefront of slowing down and frustrating societal progressions. Also, traditionally, religion divides communities. It does. Religion is very much tribal. God, a monotheistic God, is tribal. God is tribal. The Bible shows us time and time again evidence of God being a tribal God. And that creates categories of us versus them, believers, non-believers, the saints versus the heretics or sinners. Religion constantly divides communities. We see that in Northern Ireland's history with the Troubles. We see that in Israel, modern Israel today, with the Palestinian communities and the Jewish communities going back and forth for almost a 40-year period now. And with ISIS going on, we see this divide. Again, religion consistently and will continually do create categories of us versus them. And also, therefore, parity religions kind of emerged as a relief valve. Many scholars kind of argued because they have existed in the past before, or they have been primarily an alternative source of community. And we'll see both of these kind of at play together. Kind of the first modern day version of the parity religion we see comes from the famous Russian emperor Peter the Great in the early 1600s. That once he became emperor of Russia, that he quickly established a group of fellow-minded people like him who saw some of the traditions of the Russian Orthodox Church as hysterical and often laughable. And so he created the famous his Synod of Fools and Jesters as a kind of alternative or community group, but probably more so as a relief valve because of all the pressures that were placed upon the emperor because he was supposed to be God's representative on earth and also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, but yet he was bound to not force change upon the Russian Orthodox Church. So Peter the Great was kind of in this weird position. Today, you have other various groups like Justin Bieber fans who are known as Believers, as a play on word for his fans, for his name and the word believer. And then also gadgetology is something that's kind of new as well. It refers to really anything that has a kind of cult-like following, particularly among comic book characters and stuff like that. That eventually, Sailor Moon was a very popular one of these things that kind of developed this cult-like following among people, and that you had, kind of more like fantasy, but again, there's some aspects of it as well. Secondary, parody religions also emerged to point out the ridiculousness of religious beliefs, particularly in light of science and the European Enlightenment. Religious practices were often questioned with the light of the New World, with sciences and enlightenment, with a secular society ever growing. So people began to ask specific questions on religion. Why do we do these things? What's the whole purpose of them with more and more scientific knowledge? So for example, why do religions have specific dietary restrictions? For example, Jews and Muslims who have for Jewish people, a kosher diet, for Muslims, a halal diet where they avoid pork, for example. Many people theorize it was because pork needs to be cooked at the right temperatures. And if it wasn't cooked at the right temperature, you have a greater risk of developing salmonella. However, that's really not that true. The famous sociologist and anthropologist Mary Douglas, she pointed out that the reality is that pigs weren't very common to the Middle Eastern territory, that they happened to be a source that was brought in later by other conquering people. And so really the reasons for not eating pigs had more so to do with maintaining cultural identity versus health reasons. Why do religions persist that you wear special clothing or have certain dress attire? We see that the Mormon community themselves have specific clothing that they must wear. Orthodox Jewish communities have specific clothing that they must wear. Everyone knows about certain devoted Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab. So why do they have to have this in today's modern world where women are no longer, pieces of property? So again, there's a lot of questions that we have, and then of course, why does what really does Christmas decorations have to do with Christianity? We put up a tree. What does a tree have to do with the Jesus birth story? What does ornaments and candy canes and Santa Claus have to do with the birth story of Jesus? Really nothing. And so people began to point out a lot of these ridiculousness of these religious beliefs. Why, this is not really a religious belief. This is something else. And so you begin to have more and more people starting to point out the ridiculousness of religion. And probably the best case example of this in the modern time period, when I was a kid, it was George Carlin, but he's since died. But now Ricky Gervais is kind of has taken up his mantle and showing out the ridiculousness of religious beliefs, all for the purpose of comedy, but also to point out a little bit of truth. And so here's his famous sketch that he does about Noah's Ark. And I want to say, if you're not aware of Ricky Gervais's comedy, He does cuss a lot, so we are all adults here. We watch televisions and listen to shows that have cussing, so do forgive me.
37,000 different species of spider. 37,000 different species of spider. I mean, millions and billions of individuals in each species. And that's just one class, arachnid, of one phylum, Arthropoda. There could be 5 million species of animal alive now on the Earth. Best guess, okay? And that's 1% of all animal species that have ever existed. 99% of all animal species that ever existed are now extinct. And that remaining 1% is 5 million strong. Take one of those species, termites. If we were to weigh every termite alive now, it would be 10 times the tonnage of every human being on Earth. And it's statistics like that that make me think that this book isn't totally accurate. It's the Book of Noah, the children's edition. I actually got this awarded to me when I used to go to Sunday school every week. I believed in all this till I was 8. St Agnes Sunday School presented to Ricky Gervais, R-I-K-K-I, like a fucking mongoose, right? For regular attendance, not even for being good at anything, just for turning up, right? He's always here, give him a prize, he'll be back. Thank you, thank you. Let's have a look at the evidence. Long, long ago, when God first made the earth, I'll let both those points go, we haven't got time. Right. Long, long ago, by the way, according to the Bible, is 5,000 years. According to the Old Testament, the earth is no older than 5,000 years old, okay? It's actually 4.6 billion years old. Let's pop that in, pop that. 4.6 billion years ago, when God first made the earth and sky, all right, don't big it up, it's like, it comes as a package, really, doesn't it? I mean, do you know what I mean? The sky was never an optional extra. It's like, made you a planet, I can't breathe. Would you like an atmosphere? Of course I fucking would. So, well done, but everything was peaceful, everything beautiful. God made human beings too, and he wanted them to be good like himself. Arrogant. Right. But very soon they wanted their own way. They would not listen to God. They became wicked and did wicked things. Look at them doing wicked things there. You don't get much more wicked than that, do you? Fuck off. Oh, fuck off, wicked. Really. Fuck off, wicked. Really. Ah. God just looking on. Oh, carry on. See what happens. See what happens. Oh, see what happens. Yeah. Oh, see what happens. Bloke there running off with a big bag of money. Don't put it in a bank, you cunt. Right. God looked at them and said to himself, they are so wicked, I will have to wipe them off the face of the earth. Really? Really? Straight to genocide. What happened to 1 verbal and 2 written warnings? Straight to the annihilation of the entire human race because of fatty yellow trousers picked someone's nose. Really? Fuck. Anger management, man. Just calm the fuck down. Let's talk about this. Wow. I read that to Carl Pilkington, right? Who is, yes. Head like a fucking orange, I know, yeah. And I read that bit to him. They are so wicked, I'll have to wipe my face of the earth. And Carl said, he sounds gay. I said, what do you mean? He went, some gays are a bit like that. He thought God was like having a hissy fit. Like he's like, no, they treat me like a bastard, I'm going to treat them like a bastard, I'm going to show them, I'm going to wipe them out. I said, Carl, God is not gay, okay? Read the Bible, he hates them. They are so wicked, I will have to wipe them off the face of the earth. And every living thing with them. What's the squid ever done? It's gone mad. What? But he's not gay. God is not gay.
All right, so I just wanted to show you a little bit of that because, again, Ricky Gervais has kind of become a very popular, if not the most popular, atheist voice in America today. But he often uses religion in his bits, his comedy bits, and often uses things like the story of Noah. He uses the Genesis creation of Adam and Eve as jokes, of where he'll just actually just open the Bible itself and start reading it and start dissecting the Bible and saying things don't make sense with what we know with modern science. And so again, parody religions kind of emerged out of that same very much spirit to show some of the ridiculousness nature of some of the religious texts themselves. And so, like I said, the best way to look at these groups that we're going to talk about, these parody religions, is that they, particularly one in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster that we'll talk about here in just a second, is very much so a living exaggeration of religion. That's the reason it was created, it was made the way it is, shaped the way it is to exaggerate the most ridiculous elements of religion and the religious stories thereof. So, all right, so now I want to talk about real quick some of the earliest parody religion movements that we do know of, just very briefly, just to give some history of them. So to some extent, the parody religions are really nothing new. They feel very new. If you read books and study about them, they'll talk about this new, strange phenomenon. But in reality, once you look at all of human history, there's very rarely is there anything new under the sun. Most things are really recycles of older things or things that have been largely forgotten but do reemerge themselves. And this is another example. Parody religions have kind of existed before in human society, but have been largely forgotten because of the dominance of Christian history and the Christian church in European history. And so some of the earliest examples that we do have come from the ancient Greeks themselves, and more specifically, the hero cults that would emerge. And so these hero cults evolved around certain individuals. We're not sure if these individuals were actually real or mythical characters, but they were typically tied to some kind of locality. So it gave belief that some of these happened to be real individuals. Sometimes the best representative of someone's city, and so they became the representation of that individual's city. So just like Rome, for example, the city of Rome was famously founded by the twins Romulus and Remus, but eventually Romulus kills Remus and takes the city for himself. And the Romans had a small, later on, but not at the beginning, had a hero cult devoted to Romulus himself. Hence the names Romans come from the story of Romulus, and apparently the city was named after him, but we're not sure if this person was a real person or not, if something fictitious that was created. But many of them were our best early examples, and of course the most famous was Hercules himself. There's debates of whether Hercules was a real individual or was a fictitious character. However, there was various shrines dedicated to him throughout the ancient Greece. And so here's an example of a cult hero shrine, which in Greek was known as a hieron, in modern-day Turkey along the coast, the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. And so you can find these places everywhere. And so many of these were very much dedicated places. There was also later on in Roman history, when the gladiatorial games became popular, some of the gladiators kind of developed a hero cult behind them as well. And so these were shrines that were dedicated and put up places, and people would offer sacrifices to them. And so ergo, you have some kind of religious nature, religious purposes being evolved around these groups. But the most common of the parody religions that really what we can talk about from human history developed out of fraternity organizations or orders or secret societal orders as well. And so probably the most famous examples of those are Freemasonry, who still are around to this day, and the Illuminati, who do not really exist anymore, but conspiracy theorists love to bring their stories out all over the place. But these were parody religions to some extent at the core. So Freemasonry, if you're not aware of what Freemasonry is or just simply Masonry, um, Masons themselves are defined as a fraternal order or organization, organization particularly male dominated. There are some women in certain segments, but it's primarily all made up of male and only male participants. But however, their practices are highly ritualized and very much secretive. And all of their practices have overtly religious overtones thrown and played out throughout the entire group of what they do. Masonry describes themselves as a beautiful system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated symbols. Again, Masonry claims itself to be a system of activity that promotes a certain morality. Religion itself kind of makes those claims as well. Jesus himself, many of his sermons, they're morality sermons. The Sermon on the Mount, very much a morality sermon. The famous parable of the Good Samaritan and the Good Shepherd are kind of morality sermons to some extent as well. And so Masonry is very much blends elements of religion. It uses the Bible to teach moral philosophy, or particularly a moral philosophy of brotherhood, it likes to portray. It prays to a nameless deity. It does not call the God of the New Testament or Christianity God or Jehovah or Yahweh or anything like that. But sometimes they use certain other names for him, the great architect or other things like that. And so has led many people to think that Masonry is something outside of religion because it prays to a nameless deity. And it very much so teaches a naturalistic and a deistic view of religion, looking at the Bible divorced of much of its mythology and its superstiticism and just the belief of a supreme being, an unnamed being that we'll see that we've already talked about other religions like the Baha'i faith or Sikhism kind of developed. You see the same language here within Masonry. And at one point, Masonry was very popular, and particularly in Europe and the United States, it was so popular that it actually represented an alternative to modern organized religion. At one point, there were more men who were Masons than church members. More men going to Masonic meetings and Masonic lodges than they were going to church services. And it's because of that which makes me put Masonry as a parody religion, because how the church responds. The church, throughout its history, has routinely attacked Masonry and Freemasons. The Catholic Church in 1790, and then later in the 1800s, 1830 and 1850, and then you had the Baptist Church here in America in the 1930s, and well, not 1930s, sorry, the 1960s, the Methodists in the 1970s, all start attacking the Masonry, Freemasonry, dictating that people, particularly like the Catholic Church, saying that you could not be a Catholic and be a member of a Freemason church because it would categorize Masonry as trying to be religious or trying to be a religion, and therefore it's heretical. And so this is again an early example of parody religions that you can see with Freemasonry. It was created at first as this nice moral attempt to create something new for individuals, for people, for men to hang out together. but it had rapidly turned into an alternative to religion because the Bible is very much used inside a Mason church, or not a Mason church, but a Mason lodge. But they often pray to a nameless deity. To be a member of a Mason community, you have to be a monotheist. You can, and they specifically say that you have to believe in the God of Abraham, which that makes you where you can be a Muslim as well. And there are very few Muslim Masons in the world today, but even the Islamic Church does not take kindly to Masons as well, and they interpret them as a mock religion. Another group is what we already talked about, the Illuminati. And so the Illuminati have been made famous by Dan Brown's famous novel in the early 2000s, Angels and Demons, and all hosts of conspiracy theorists really ever since the late 1970s. But in truth, the Illuminati were a historical group that existed for about 30 to 40 year history in the late 18th century. They were founded by Adam Wassenhaupt in 1776. Great year. And this Bavarian chapter of the Illuminati was basically just a secret brotherhood who were made up of primary members within the Bavarian society who had a specific goal of opposing any forms of superstition, any forms of obstructionism, religious influences on life and on school, institutions and government, and also the abuse of power within the Catholic Church. And so they tried to basically, the Illuminati group was a response to the emergence of the Enlightenment. These groups of people believed that the Enlightenment was a good thing and that they formed a society in order to make sure that the Enlightenment would continue to progress and that the church would stop interrupting societal progressions in their mind and this is their attempt at having a separation of church and state to some extent, and to help promote a secular society. But in this 30, 40, 50-year history, the group never had more than 25,000 members at one time, and it was very much localized to Germany, little parts of France, little parts of England, but it was nothing like what Dan Brown and all the conspiracy theorists make it out to be. They were in fact members of the German elite, the hierarchy, the elite staff, and most of their members were in various parts of the government or of the Catholic Church in Germany. But their probably most famous members were, for several years, were the Dukes of Gotha and Weimar. And so if you know your German history, Gotha and Weimar are where pretty much were the ones that helped push forth a German state that eventually will happen in 1484. But you can see the roots of it establishing with the Illuminati. But they were quickly outlawed by Prince Charles Theodore of Bavaria, and then subsequently the Catholic Church as well by the 1790s. And the group really just faded into non-existence, or they became members of other secret societies in France or in the UK. But typically, the Illuminati wasn't what conspiracy groups were, but they were some sort of parody religion to some extent in that they tried to organize themselves and dedicate themselves to particular goals. And so they would meet in churches, places that they call churches. And so they had some levels of institutions that they would, instead of reading the liturgy for the day or the Bible that you typically have in a Catholic Mass, they were reading scientific materials instead, or reading classical literature, Plato, Aristotle, things like that in their meetings. So it had some elements of religion, and so therefore it's kind of classified as a religious group because they would use religious symbols. And just a side note, it really was a couple years later that a German historian, Augustin Burrell, was the first person to advocate one of the very first conspiracy theorists that attributed to that, the Illuminati were attributed to. And so he theorized that the Illuminati were actually behind the French Revolution. And so you start seeing with his book, and then later on in the 1840s, with the German Revolution, the Illuminati appear again. And then World War I and the rise of communism, the Illuminati appear again. But they really stopped existing at this point in 1790. But conspiracy theories loved making these stories up, and you need a bad guy, and the Illuminati apparently were it. Now let's get to the heart of the matter, and let's talk about one of the first examples, and probably one of my favorite stuff to read, just because it is hilarious. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Yes, I did say that. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, or FSM, was created in 2005 and was very much a social phenomenon, and to an early extent an internet phenomenon that emerged through emails, primarily in message boards, when those message boards used to be a thing. Before you had Facebook, we all would go on certain message boards. But yeah, it emerged in 2005 as a satirical movement to point out the ridiculousness of religion, but specifically the ridiculousness of having religious views like intelligent design being forcibly taught in public schools. There was this great debate that was going on. And so Bobby Henderson was the guy who created the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and he was somewhat a recent graduate of Oregon State University as a bachelor's in science, and he was making his career, not very successful at the time, but teaching, and he heard about this controversy that was going on in Kansas and going on later in Texas and in all kinds of states throughout America during President Bush's second term, and that many state governments were forcing local teachers to teach intelligent design either alongside of evolutionaryism or in place of evolutionary theories. And so Bobby Henderson, a recent graduate who taught public schools, I think out west at the time, was very upset about this demand that you had to teach intelligent design, which was another way of teaching religion and truth. And so he famously petitioned the Kansas State Department of Education in April of 2005, and basically, and one of the petitioners for the bill said that we should allow beliefs. Intelligent design was a valid belief, and we should teach valid beliefs in the classroom. And so Bobby Henderson picked up on that and wrote a famous article or a famous letter to the State Board of Education there, saying, well, my beliefs are just as valid as intelligent design. And he goes and lists about that he is a member of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and goes and lists a entire theology in a very short, I think four pages of his entire belief system, and says that my beliefs are just as valid as your beliefs about intelligent design. And we'll get to that later, because he brings up a very good point here. But ultimately, lots and lots of people heard about what was going on in Bobby Henderson's fight against the Kansas State Board. Eventually, he lost his battle But then later, I think 5 years later, the Kansas Department of Education reversed its decision because students were getting confused or were complaining, teachers were complaining, parents were complaining enough, and so scores were going down, and so they reversed their decision. But anyhow, the word of Henderson's fight and his, and particularly his religion of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster spread like wildfire on public television. Eventually NBC News did reports on it, but more so the internet. It spread like wildfire. And in just 1 month, in the month of August, Bobby Henderson, no, in May, the very following May month, Bobby Henderson received over 60,000 emails, personal emails that people had found him requesting to join his religion, to help create this church. And so Bobby Henderson was overwhelmed and was being interviewed by Mount Lauer and everybody from NBC, CBS. Everybody was wanting a piece of him and his story. But eventually, as a joke, he created a book. He created the Bible for the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster in November of the same year. And it's a hilarious read. I've got you guys reading some excerpts of it. Please do so. It's quite funny, and it's yeah. Just take it all in jest. Take it all as a big joke. Don't take anything seriously, but it's quite funny, and it looks like something that you would see on Adult Swim or Comedy Central. But his movement had grown so much that eventually by 2009, that outside of him, because he let it go after he created the book, he let it go. He made lots of money, and I think if I remember right, he retired for a while out in one of the Pacific Island teaching science to kids out there for a while before coming back to America. But he's very much has led a very, very private life and doesn't get too involved with the church. But the church has exploded since there by followers. And many followers eventually had created their own kind of religious organization, the International Society for Flying Spaghetti Monster Awareness. It was created in 2009, and by that time in 2009, it had over 20,000 members worldwide. And I think right now it claims about over 1 million people now have identified themselves with the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. So it's become a thing, very much so. It has become a thing. So let's talk about. Let's analyze his argument here that he made to the Kansas State Board, because this is the real key of why parody religions are very important. And so what he does is he basically he uses a very famous line of argument that was made by the famous British philosopher and critic Bertrand Russell, his famous teapot analogy. And he's basically what the Flying Spaghetti Monster church and religion in his argument is basically Bertrand Russell's teapot analogy, but just made complete differently. So here's basically where the analogy lies. So let me get to the right point here. So yeah, I already said this about Russell. And so this is Russell's analogy here. So he says, imagine if I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars, somewhere out in space, between these 2 points that we see that takes over a year, if not longer, to travel with space rockets to Earth and Mars in the vastness of space. Somewhere in between there is a China teapot that's evolving with, or not evolving, but revolving around with the planets, like the Earth, like Mars, around the sun in an elliptical orbit. At some point in between Earth and Mars, we don't know. And it's been there for millions of years. And nobody would be able to disprove my assertion. And so he's writing this in the 1920s. because the teapot is too small to be revealed by our even most powerful instruments. And it is intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt it. So basically what he's trying to say is there's a teapot. If I, Bertrand Russell, I make the claim that I believe there's a teapot out there in the middle of space, a small teapot that's maybe 10 inches tall, maybe 12 inches wide, maybe something like that, out in the middle of space, that even our most powerful telescopes, radio telescopes, satellite images probably would not be able to recognize it. But Bertrand Russell believes with his whole heart that it's out there. The truth is, you cannot empirically disprove him that it's out there. You can't. But we all know the ridiculousness of that claim. It's ridiculous to think that how did a China pot get out in space? How would it be in orbit that far removed in space from the Earth and Mars? It would never have broken away from the gravitational pull of one or the other. But yet it's out there. And so it's breaking all the laws of physics, and you can try to point out the data, you can try to point out the impossibility of that, but yet Bertrand Russell can make that claim and make it ardently powerful. And he uses this analogy to point out the same thing about religion. Religion really has no empirical proof. You can show all the evidence against religion and religious claims, but yet the truth of it is you can't go against the nature of the believer. And so it's very much a false starter. You can't rationally criticize or get into an argument or be able to disprove to a believer that God doesn't exist or that religion isn't real. You're not going to be so successful. And Russell makes this point because he tries to make it obvious that really the point of his argument is that the philosophical burden of proof doesn't lie on me disproving you. It really lies on you and your ridiculous claim. Again, that there's this teapot that's out there in space. Well, prove it. And if you can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. And then you can say, no, I know it exists. I know it exists. I have drawings of it. I have writings of it. But we need empirical proof. We need scientific data. We need pictures of it. But I have this. I have these old documents that were passed down from my father, from my father, from my father, and all these stories from them. But again, you need to prove it to us, and you really can't. And so that was basically what his argument was with the teapot analogy, is that religion needs to prove it is right. Science doesn't need to do that. And that he's trying to reverse the dialogue here, because typically the dialogue has always been the opposite, that we have to disprove religious claims and prove scientific claims. And he's saying, no, that's ridiculous. It should be the other way around, but it's not. You cannot believe in something just because a person says so. Bertrand Russell's point is it needs to be proven. You need to make your proofs have claim, and therefore you have to have empirical evidence. And this is the whole point of the scientific process, is to have empirical evidence. Religion needs to be subjected to that as well. And so Bobby Henderson uses that same argument. He says, so for example, we have scientific data here, and we have the consensus of all of scientific communities that the evolutionary process is real, and that this is probably how the world has come about because of the empirical evidences that we do have. But Kansas is saying, no, we need to have intelligent design taught as well, because it's empirically possible for that as well. But the truth is, it's not. We have scientific evidence that much of the stories behind the Bible cannot be validated, cannot be true. And so why is it that religion gets put on the same level as science? And so basically what Bobby Henderson was trying to argue was, well, then let's replace Christianity. Let's replace that because it's too sacred to us. And let's insert what I believe. I believe that there's a flying spaghetti monster up there in the universe who is responsible for creating everything in the world, but yet he's invisible. We cannot see him, but yet there's proof of his existence, but not really, because as Bobby Henderson would later say, that the flying spaghetti monster turns the data against scientists that disprove his existence in order to test the faith of his believers, of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. So if that was the intelligent design, that my belief of a flying spaghetti monster, which I have no claim except this tradition of my people that Bobby Henderson claims in his letter, of my ancestors worshiping this flying spaghetti monster, I have the exact same amount of scientific data that you have about intelligent design. So if you're so adamant about that we need to make sure beliefs are known and that all alternatives are truly made, then by your own logic here, Bobby Henderson asserts, you need to teach my faith in religion, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And of course, Kansas people said, no, we're not going to do that. And that was really the whole point. So the religion evolves around this same thing of the teapot, this analogy, and the philosophical burden of proof. Where does it lie? Religion always gets the exception. We do this with, are there aliens? People say, oh, I don't believe it because there's no hard proof of this. Or if there's ghosts, someone comes up and says, I saw a ghost. We don't believe in ghosts because there's no physical proof. We all know the mind plays tricks on you. Noises, the house creaks, you're constantly paranoid. But why does religion get the exception? And that's basically both Bertrand Russell's claim and Bobby Henderson's claim here. And the whole reasons why the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster emerges, or these parody religions emerge, in the whole point is to show and ask the question, why does religion get the exception? So we're not going to dwell on that too much, but I want to point out some of the ridiculousness of Flying Spaghetti Monster's beliefs, because even though Bobby Henderson made all of this as a joke to prove his point, it sort of has run away from him. And he acknowledges that it's not, he has no part of in the church whatsoever. The international group, nothing like that. He stays away from them. He leads a private, very much a private life. But the group has emerged to be something of its own, and it has grown very much so, to the fact that I think in where was it? Yes, and that eventually it's been able to challenge certain laws. For example, there's this picture here where councilmen have been sworn in with elements of this religious group. Instead of wearing a yarmulke, they wear a colander or a spaghetti strainer on their head as a sign of their religious faith, similar to that of a yarmulke or a hijab or a turban within Sikhism. That this colander is the same as mine. And there's been people, particularly in Europe, who since 2009 and 2012 and 14 have challenged certain laws about religious headwear. And they've all won their cases. And so you see a growing belief of this. But anyhow, let's look at some of the things. So Henderson has said in his book that the only dogma allowed in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is the rejection of dogma or doctrine. So there's no really official doctrine of the teachings of the church or this parody group. However, there are some doctrines that have been clearly designed as satirical, and who have been clearly designed as composing direct reactions to intelligent design beliefs. But some people have listed this as personal beliefs, and so I don't know if this is a joke or not, but we need to talk about them. So for creation. So, according to the Flying Spaghetti Monster Church, they believe in an invisible, undetectable flying spaghetti monster who created the universe after drinking heavily one night. And so, the drinking heavily, it explains why creation isn't perfect and why creation has flaws and why there is such things as evil in the world is because the spaghetti monster clearly didn't have his best mind while he was creating. He was drunk. They also talk about how all evidence for evolution that there is, it was actually is in fact created by the flying spaghetti monster himself in order to, quote, test the faith of his followers. And that all scientific data is manipulated by the flying spaghetti monster with his noodly appendages. And so therefore, even though scientists show proof and proof again that he doesn't exist, he says, no, we believe that the church, the flying spaghetti monster is actually behind all this, and he's doing this in order to test our faith. So therefore, we will never accept scientific data. There's also the belief in pirates, and this comes from Henderson himself in his argument against the Kansas board. It says that God had originally, this flying spaghetti monster, God had originally created pirates, but pirates have gone away, and we'll talk about pirates here in just a second. But that they believe that pirates were absolute divine beings, and that they were the true origins of their faith, and they call themselves Pastafarianisms, or Pastafarians. And that the negative images that we have in history and the negative images in pop culture that we have about pirates are in fact propaganda of the church themselves. And so Bobby Henderson put this idea out there that saying, no, in fact, pirates are a good thing, and that this is what God created, this flying spaghetti monster God created were in fact pirates being the first humans on Earth. And that, when there's the presence of pirates in the world, that in fact things involving the earth tend to go well. So things like global warming. And so he said, so look at where pirates exist in the world today. The most pirates live in Somalia and off the coast of Africa. But you can look at the direct correlation with the rise of CO2 emissions or the rise of global warming aspects per country, and Somalia routinely has the lowest levels out there of carbon emissions, of CO2 levels, of impacts on global warming. Somalia always ranks at the very bottom, if not the bottom, of every single list. And so Bobby Henderson, jokingly says, see, here's a direct correlation. Because there's more pirates in Somalia, therefore there's less global warming. And he uses that point to talk about that's hysterical. That's ridiculous to believe. There's no scientific claims to that. And then Bobby Henderson shot back at the Kansas board and said, same thing for God. You're looking at data that has just basic correlations that just happens to be happenstance, but we know scientifically it doesn't correlate to each other empirically. It's just coincidence. But yet you claim it as religion and it's sanctified. I'm going to claim this as religion and ask you to claim it as sanctified as well, or to keep your logic in tow. So this is why Church of Flying Spaghetti Monsters believe in all this. The afterlife. In the gospel, it talks about believes that good people will go to heaven upon their death, and that heaven is full of quote-unquote clean prostitutes and strippers, and that there is a massive beer volcano in which people can drink endless supply of beer. However, that there is a place where people will go. Bad people will go to heaven upon their death, and hell is full of the opposite, full of very flat beer, full of prostitutes and strippers, and strippers who have STDs. So it's truly, truly a hell in his mind. Holidays. Church of Flying Spaghetti Monsters believers, Pastafarians, celebrate Fridays as their Sabbaths. And they must all end their prayers with the line ramen. Like amen, but ramen. Play on words with the noodle food ramen. Pastafarians also celebrate Pastover, making fun of Passover around Easter time, in which they're encouraged to consume as much pasta as humanly possible. They also celebrate what they call holiday around Christmas time, in which believers are free to celebrate it however they want to and call it whatever they want to. If they want to call it Christmas, they can call it Christmas. If they want to call it Hanukkah, call it Hanukkah. If they want to call it Kwanzaa, call it Kwanzaa. If they want to call it just Happy Holidays, they can call it that. And they also celebrate Ramadan. It's a play on words with Ramadan and ramen noodles, in which the Pastafarians must fast from pasta only. They can eat anything else, but they can't eat pasta for a month. So again, you can see all of this is parodies of everything. They also have September 19th here in America, which is truly is a real holiday. The International Taught Like a Pirate Day, and so a lot of festivals occur among Pastafarians during that day. And also, Pastafarians are encouraged to wear their religious garbs, either pirate regalia or to wear a pastra strainer or colander on their head. But they're only to wear those on special occasions. Specifically, the book talks about, or their website talks about, that they must wear it when they're taking pictures for government IDs in order to challenge some of the government ID laws about religious headwear. And so far, everybody has been successful here in the United States, in Canada, in Austria, in the Netherlands, and in Sweden and Germany. People who have challenged the law in court have actually won. And not too long ago, I think 2019, there was the first ever Pastafarian minister was able to give a opening prayer for the, I think it was the state government of the state meeting in Alaska, but now I'm thinking about it, I think it was actually a local meeting in which they were allowed to give a prayer. And then Netflix is supposed to be doing a special here soon, a documentary about Pastafarianism as a belief system that is on the rise. So that's another reason why I want to talk about them. But ultimately, parody religions really have emerged kind of out as glorified fandom. And besides that mockery of religion, we've seen an emergence of certain sincere levels of fandom that have bordered upon religiosity. And so Beaver fans are probably the most prominent one, but there are some others. And so scholars have labeled these fan clubs as parody religions because, one, they inspire cult-like following. Two, they do have hierarchical organizational and structures very similar to religious connotations. And three, that they do offer some type of life-changing experiences or teachings with their literature. And so there are actually several of them. But the two most popular ones here in America are Dudism and Jediism. Yes, Jediism of Star Wars. Since 2001, there has been a push to make Jediism in the United States and in the UK as a religion. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But first, let's talk about Dudism. Dudism is sort of considered it's considered by scholars as a parody religion and often gets talked about. However, its practitioners would never call it a religion. They would call it a philosophy or a lifestyle choice, very similar to how Buddhists or Taoists talk about their own religious traditions. They wouldn't see it as religion, they would see it as philosophy or a lifestyle. But Dudism, however, was inspired by the 1998 film by the Coen brothers, The Big Lebowski. And so some of you recognize this character here. This is the dude, Lebowski in the movie. And the main character, who's played by Jeff Bridges in the film, consistently throughout the film espouses, either in his actions or his deeds, Zen-like philosophy of the way he's talking about it. And so a lot of people have picked up on that, and particularly one guy, a journalist, Oliver Benjamin, who was a foreign correspondent in Thailand at the time, who absolutely loved the Coen brothers film. By 2005, had organized a small group of people who were fanatical fans of the movie, but also of the kind of philosophy that they would talk about in message board groups that was being espoused by the Big Lebowski. And so they started having kind of religious-like ceremonies or writings. And so Oliver Benjamin, famously put out the Du De Ching, which is a textbook, a religious textbook that combines elements of the Tao Te Ching, a famous Taoist teaching in religious books, with elements of the Big Lebowski, and rewrites lots of words, rewrites a lot of phrases within the book to put it in the language of the dude from the movie. And his movement has grown. Last time I looked, when I did research for this lecture in May of 2017, that it claimed about over 450,000 members. And every member is ordained, and this is an ordination here certificate that you can receive from them, that you become a Dudist priest. And like I said, the religion itself promotes a modern form of Taoism, and it blends other ideas, Epicurean philosophy with Zen Buddhism, teachings of Jesus as well, and various human philosophers here in America like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Kurt Vonnegut. The goal is to have and to maintain your inner harmony, and that's really the goal of the teachings of Dudism. To maintain your inner harmony when facing challenges, like you see in the movie with the Big Lebowski. The dude never loses his composure, but really he does a couple of times, but you can't tell that to one of them. However, he does prioritize the very simple things in life. The movie constantly shows you that Lebowski is very much prioritizes pleasure above anything else, everyday pleasures over societal achievements, and it teaches the primary doctrine of, quote unquote, the dude abides, which is a famous line at the end of the Coen brothers movie, the dude abides, and kind of sums up the entire philosophy of it. And so people act like the dude. And since 2009, various books have been published that reinterpret various versions of Taoism, particularly American forms of Taoism or Zen Buddhism, through the prism of the Big Lebowski. Even Jeff Bridges himself has wrote books. The actor who plays the Big Lebowski has wrote books or has done tape audios where they would reinterpret or record him reading Buddhist philosophies or reinterpreting Buddhist texts into the language of the dude himself. And May 6th is considered a religious holiday among people who celebrate Dudism. It's known as the Day of the Dude. And you'll see that they'll have these various groups where people dress up like the dude and attend meetings, and they typically still dress up this way and attend various things that Jeff Bridges is doing, either red carpet because he's an actor, so red carpet moments where he's promoting another movie. These people will show up still dressed like the dude, and Jeff Bridges accepts all of these guys very well. But however, it's kind of a blend again of a fan club, people who really like the movie, but yet who have turned elements of the movie and have combined it with religious teachings of their own and have kind of developed their own identity by now. In California and Arizona and Nevada, you can be married by a Dudist priest. They're out there. You can get married and get an official license, a marriage license, and that marriage license is recognized by those states and subsequently all other states as well. So again, it has elements of religion to it. The next one of the fan groups is Jediism. And so again, this is serious. This is real. Since 2001, Jediism has attracted public attention, and this coincides, if any Star Wars fans out there, this coincides with the prequel movies that were being made in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And so in 2001, a famous online campaign was begun in English countries in order to get Jediism as a officially recognized religion in national census. And so these were all done in British Commonwealth countries. So you had in Australia people who actually did this on their 2001 census data would list Jedi as their official religion. So over 70,000 people. In New Zealand, 53,000. In Canada, 21,000. In the UK, almost 400,000 people declared themselves as Jedi. And so it forced the government into a weird situation of what do we do? Do we list this as something official or do we see it as something as a joke? And they took it as a joke. But however, since then, people who find themselves believing in this Jediism have pushed back against it. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But what is Jediism? So Jediism claims it is a philosophy, but I would say it's quasi-religious, based off depictions of Jedi characters in the Star Wars universe. So they look at the Star Wars films, the Star Wars books, comics, TV shows, and they have formulated patterns of what is Jediism and what are the teachings of the Jediism. So within the books and within the movies, Jedis themselves are often depicted as ascetic, monastic religious orders. Even Luke and Mark Hamill and Luke in the second to last, the Last Jedi film that recently came out, he even said religion of the Jedi. He called it that within the movie, and so you can see that it has these religious type characterizations upon them. And George Lucas himself, the director and creator of Star Wars, acknowledged several times since the 70s that the Jedi are and the Force itself are inspired by Eastern religions, particularly Hinduism, Shinto, Buddhism, and Taoism, as well as Greek and samurai philosophy. That he pulled all these elements and he used all these elements of religion and philosophy in order to create a religion and philosophy for this fictitious group. So it makes the sense why people recognize the religious elements of it and wanted to bring it to the real world. So fans have created their own religion and to some extent, and it has its own regulations and codes. You can go see it on their website. They do have an official website here, the Church of the Jedi, that you can go and look and you'll see these codes, and they have teachings that they describe. The 16 teachings are described as Jedi belief systems. And so it does operate a website. The fans do. The Temple of the Jedi Order It operates as a hierarchy that has elected people who can excommunicate fans, who grant ordinations, who offer teachings and courses that people must pass in order to progress within the religion, very similar to Scientology as well. And they often censor bad members and have some kind of church discipline as well. Every third month, or the 21st of every month, is considered a Jedi holy day throughout the year. And of course, because they're Star Wars fans, May 4th, for the May the 4th be with you, is often celebrated as a religious holiday. Now to this designation. Since 2005, the Church of the Jedi have fought for legal recognition. In the United States, the Church of the Jedi are recognized as a charity group, and so therefore they enjoy the same tax exemptions that churches enjoy here in the United States. So legally, they're recognized as a church, but a charity group. Um, so similar to Catholic charities and stuff like that. So there are some ways that they have won in the United States, and there are churches of the Jedi out in California that you can go to, out in San Francisco and stuff. In the UK, however, it's I think 3 times it has been brought up, and it has been routinely denied every single time that Jediism is not recognized as a religious group. And people have often pointed out that there are more registered Jedi in the UK than there are Scientologists, but Scientologists are recognized as a official religion in the UK, but Jediism isn't. And they point out the irony of that aspect, which I enjoy as well. And then famously, this where Jediism got world recognition was that in 2015, several Turkish students challenged unsuccessfully their government's position on their right to build a Jedi temple on campus of a university there. They wanted to build an area for their people to congregate, and the Turkish government said no, and there was several days of protesting, small minor protesting in Turkey, but it garnered world attention because they were allowed to build a mosque. The student population was allowed to build a mosque on the university campus, but they weren't. The student population wasn't allowed to build a Jedi temple because the Turkish government said that's not religion, that's fake. And it drew this harsh, it drew the world's attention to this. And so I wanted to talk about these two groups because mainly you can see there's elements of comedic laugh to them, but also there's some elements of true religion here. So it brings me really to the final point and the whole point of this lecture. So why do these things happen? I believe that the reason we're talking about this, and I wanted to lecture on it, is because they bring up 3 important issues that are raised. 1, parody religions speak to an inherent reality about humans. We tend to create religions. It's what we do as humans. All of these examples demonstrate clear attempts at creating some kind of system of value, whether it's for comedic jokes like Pastafarianism, or with Jediism or Dudism, there's some elements of maintaining and cultivating personal ethics or personal philosophy, things that religions do in and of themselves. And so if humans, we just have this inherent desire to create systems of which we develop our own kind of morality. And all of these are examples that demonstrate how religion pervades all aspects of human reality. Again, religion is what makes us human. And even when we're doing something as a joke, like Pastafarianism, like Bobby Henderson, he's using it to make a point. The point runs away with him, from people who like his idea, and eventually, a couple years later, it becomes a parody religion by 2009, and something that the original creator of it never intended to actually be a real thing and took it as a joke, but has since started to become a real thing. I've met at least one Pastafarian at a religious conference, academic religious conference in Boston. And so there are people who actually believe this stuff, and they were sincere about it. I kept thinking they were joking, this was an act. But again, Netflix is doing a documentary about it here soon. It is a growing phenomenon. Second, parody religions speak to another inherent reality about humans. We need to have community. We need to have identity. All of those examples that I just gave are really systems of community that were developed, systems of identity that were developed. And very much so, religion is a cultural system of languages and culture and society. Some can be ethical, like Jewish religion is very ethical system of religion, but not really, well, let me rephrase that. Someone can be ethnically Jewish, but not religiously Jewish. And someone can be ethnically not Jewish, but they can be Jewish religiously. And the reason that that happens is because of what religion does. Religion creates a culture, it creates an identity. And so, lots of Jews do this in America or in Israel, that they don't find themselves very religious, don't believe anything that's in the Tanakh, but they will religiously practice Passover, religiously practice Rosh Hashanah, or they will do Hanukkah or Purim. They'll do the festivals. They will keep a kosher diet, even though they don't believe in God Himself, because they recognize it's those things that make them Jewish. It creates an identity for them. These parody religions do the same thing as well. There's a community that's created of like-minded individuals who think religion is a joke and this Pastafarianism is pretty funny, and they start meeting together. People who are fans of Star Wars or the Big Lebowski film, and develop some type of sincere bond and devotion to their fandom. And so religion seems to do that. And again, that's just what religion does. It creates community. The third thing, parody religions speak to another inherently reality about religion. Religion tends to dominate our culture, and it tends to abuse its power with the special places that it has within our society. And religion tends to be slow to change. And all of these parody religions kind of point that out, particularly the Pastafarianism the most. Dominant religions become institutions in society. That's why we call them dominant religions, like Christianity is a dominant force in American society. If you want to understand American politics, you got to understand Christianity in America. If you want to understand American history, you got to understand America's religious history. It's just in our DNA. Yet, when society wants to change and needs to change, religion tends to be the element that slows it down. Women's rights, African American rights here in America. The church was a source of frustration for these movements. With the abolitionist movement in the 1840s and 1850s and 60s, there was just as many adamant, hardened believers of Jesus and of the gospel, of Paul's message about freeing the slave from bondage, but then also thought the Bible sanctified slavery, or would use passages from Genesis to justify the treatment of African Americans, or to deny women the right to vote. They would use the Bible, they would use religion, and the religious leaders often were at the forefront. Just as much as, to be fair, they were on the forefront of those those societal changes as well. It's no coincidence that the African American church was at the heart of the civil rights movement. It's no coincidence that the Episcopal Church in America was at the heart of the women's rights movement, because eventually it was the Episcopal Church that were some of the first women were allowed to become ministers. And so again, religion can be a source of resistance, and it thus leads to a lot of abandonment of religion or the creation of something new. And this is what this lecture is all about. The creation of something new, really in response to all these things that religion, particularly the dominant form of religion, has largely missed out.